We have Walt Dryfoos here to talk about moving forward in your career. And Walt is the Associate Vice President of Advancement Services at the University of Washington. And there he provides leadership and vision in the development and use of enabling technologies and systems in support of the University of Washington Advancement. He oversees the operations of gift processing, strategic technology initiatives, donor stewardship and recognition, and also the annual giving programs. Among his accomplishments are successful completion of 3 comprehensive capital campaigns and 4 database conversions. Since 1981, he has filled positions of increasing responsibility in the field, including 9 years at UC Berkeley, 11 and a half years at Washington State, and here at the University of Washington since 2002. Walt holds a degree in rhetoric and also a master's of sociology from the University of Cal Berkeley, and he also has a master's of counseling at St. Mary's College of California. So I'm going to hand it over to him and let him take it away.
Thanks, Kyle. Thank you, and thank you for coming to my session. I know that you have many choices of session providers today, and I appreciate you flying with me. Now, a couple of disclaimers. First of all, I'm obviously, as I noted in my intro of my boss, Connie, I really shouldn't be talking about moving your career forward because my career has been stagnant for 23 years. But that's because I went up like a meteor and then flashed out. But the other thing is that the word management considerations is a double entendre in this, because I'm speaking from the point of view of management, but I'm also speaking to you from the point of view of your desire to get into management. And I don't think that's a necessary career track for everybody, but in a lot of ways it becomes significant because it turns out that in a lot of our institutions, management people get better compensation, and so it's hard to reach the levels of compensation you want sometimes unless you take on some management responsibilities. I'm actually jealous of Chuck here, our fundraising scientist, because he's managed to create his own job. He's the only fundraising scientist either he or I have ever met. So congratulations, Chuck. Just some beginning thoughts about this topic. And the reason I can speak extemporaneously about this topic is that this consideration is part of every annual performance review I do with my own direct reports. And so those of you who are my direct reports, and there's at least one of you in the room, have already heard a lot of this stuff. The other thing is that my experience for the last almost 32 years is exclusively in institutions of higher education. And so there's a bias here toward advanced education, advanced degrees, and that is inherent in working in institutions of higher education. Nobody else besides institutions of higher education and certain professions like law or medicine or pharmacy, for example, really place this level of emphasis on advanced degrees. So that there's a bias there, and I will also talk about some other biases I have as we progress through here. I currently supervise 13 direct reports, and over my career, and I've had another career in mental health as well, I got my first management job at a state mental hospital in 1977. So I've done a bit of management myself, and I have been managed that whole time because I have never been El Supremo in any organization under nobody's management. So the first 3 things relative to preparing yourself for a management position is that there are 3 elements of management that exist in every management position in every industry I've ever heard of. And those are personnel management, budget management, and strategic planning. Those are 3 things that you need to figure out how to involve yourself in to prepare for your career in management, if that's the way you want to go. The way I like to do this is that I bundle these things together with annual report performance reviews. And so they're not divorced. When you think about what you're going to ask for a performance review, I say, what did you accomplish? Tell me what you accomplished. Tell me how your accomplishments compared to your goals. Tell me what you accomplished that wasn't in your plan and what you accomplished that was in your plan, and tell me how I can help you as your manager. And then what I do is I ask my direct reports to administer the same questionnaire. It's a self review and analysis with each of theirs, and we roll it all up. And then, of course, I present it to my boss and say, look what I did. So it all carries forward, but it's also part of the planning process to look back, then we plan to look forward, and then we plan the budget around what our forward-looking plan is, conditional on getting the budget requirements. So you need to think about, how am I going to get some experience in budget management and in strategic planning and in personnel management. Now, budget breaks out into a couple of categories. One is your payroll obligations, and payroll is salaries and benefits. You need to understand that. At our institution, a benefit load runs from 28 to 33% of salaries, and so that's different for every institution, but you need to be aware of that, because your salary line is not the same as as the budget line for that individual, and that's something important to understand. And it is different because different people take advantage of different options. Some health plans within your menu may be more expensive than others, cost me, the employer, more. And also, for example, at the University of Washington, as you age, you're entitled to commit more of your resources, your income, into the retirement plan. So when you're over 50, for example, you can add another 2.5%, and the university will match that. That's 10% and 10% in my case, being over 50. So that's why it can be different from 28 to 33%. And people like me cost more for obvious reasons. The other part of budget is operations, and we try to keep operations money in operations and personnel money in personnel, because operations money is more ephemeral and typically tends to be less committed to ongoing efforts, aside from things like paying for the phones and whatnot. We like to keep our ops a little more flexible, and when you lock it into an FTE, it's hard to break out of that. See if you can get an opportunity to manage some budget money, and then remember that you did and put it on your resume. That's important to me when I'm looking at people that I want to hire as managers. The second thing is your HR function. Now, when I talk about being a supervisor, I'm talking about being responsible for hiring, training, evaluating, corrective action, all of those kinds of things. And that's the second element of this that you need to figure out a way to get some experience in. Now, I find that some of my most experienced managers in this sphere are people who come out of the student calling program. We employ 80 student callers in our organization, and there's significant turnover because they need to be students and they graduate out. So some of my student calling people, like Kyle sitting in the back there running the camera, by the time he's done with 2 or 3 years working in student calling, he's going to have interviewed, hired, managed, and said goodbye to many dozens of people. When you get to be more senior, as they say in terms of being old, like me, you don't really get the opportunity to do that as frequently. So it's a great experience for those people in the student calling program. Participate in search committees when you get the opportunity, and figure out how to do this this part of the job. One of the most challenging elements of this, of course, is corrective action. And you really don't want to have to do it. But when you do have to do it, what I always do is I go right to my HR people. I never try to wing it. Don't ever try to wing it. Use the HR professionals. Help. Work with them. You don't have to take what they say as the rote, but you need to figure out how to do that. And really, corrective action is advised, is a term of art here. This isn't about discipline. I'm not talking about firing people. That can be one outcome of corrective action, but I'm talking about genuinely attempting to remediate some issue or deficiency in an employee so that they become more productive and meet your standards. So we don't let it go. We do corrective action because we don't want to have to take those more drastic steps of discipline or separation. In fact, it turns out that aside from budget-related layoffs, most of the separations that I've been involved in have either been because of outright malfeasance, dishonesty, or because we drove the person crazy and they became mentally ill. So that can happen too, and sometimes you just don't want to have mentally ill people in the workplace. On the other hand, I appreciate your tolerance in that respect. The third thing is strategic planning and visioning. And this is something that I genuinely expect from everybody that works in my organization. I have a concept that I call Headroom. I talked about this last year for those of you who were here. Headroom is actually a term that I got out of being a musician. I play the electric bass, and in playing the electric bass, what you find is that you need to have a certain amount of capacity in your amplification system that's higher than the signal, the highest level signal that you're going to put out. Otherwise, you get distortion. And so you want to be using less than the capacity, unless you really want distortion, which sometimes people do. But in bass, you really don't want too much distortion. Jack Bruce being the exception. Jack Bruce actually played with broken speakers because he liked that distorted sound so much. But you can hear that on some of the old Cream records. He's gotten over that since. But so Headroom is a metaphor for having more capacity to work than your job actually requires. And I encourage each of you to figure out how to get some headroom in your job. Get out of the tactical, get out of the day-to-day, and take some opportunities to think larger, think more globally about how to be really great at what you do and what needs to be done. That's what I want you to use the Headroom for. If you work for me, I pretty much require that. I don't want people who just come in and do their job and go home. I want people who come in and do their job and then think about how to make their job easier or better or more interesting. That is the personal version of strategic planning. Then as you get into participating in management, we're going to ask you, what should we be doing next year that we're not doing this year? What should we stop doing next year that we are doing now? And what does everybody want us to do? And out of that queue of things, what should we be doing and how should we prioritize it? I need help with this. I crowdsource strategic planning. And if you work for me, you're going to be part of the crowd who helps me figure out how to make those decisions about strategic planning. Of course, it depends on your organization and so forth. And I know that many people, one of the reasons we actually have this conference is that many people, and maybe even most, come from organizations that only have 1, 2, or 3 people in the whole office that do the kinds of work that we do, and we get overwhelmed. Sometimes there's just too much work to be done. You need to figure out a way to get yourself some headroom, because sometimes what you use your headroom for is to figure out how to do that work more efficiently and effectively so that you can have more headroom. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense. I just sat at lunch with a person in a one-person reporting shop, and he said he has one canned report and everything else he does is ad hoc. So what would you suggest in a situation like that for getting some headroom? Can you think of anything? That was a question. You guys are free to answer it.
Analyze the common denominators and start canning it.
Start making some more canned reports so you're not spending all your time doing ad hoc tactical work. That's right. So those three things, that's not development specific, not fundraising specific, not advancement specific. Those are requirements for managers in any field, in any industry, for-profit, nonprofit, and so forth. Now, as we get into what we need in higher education, the next thing is that we often require degrees. We require bachelor's degrees, we require advanced degrees, and people ask me all the time, well, what degrees should I get? And particularly in our field, they'll say, you know, should I get an MBA? Should I get become a certified public accountant? Should I get an MIS, Manager of Information Systems degree? Should I get a computer science degree? Should I get a statistics degree? And I say to them, well, which one of those sounds good to you? And they'll say, well, none. I actually like to read trashy novels in my spare time, and I can't imagine doing the reading for a degree in computer science. I can barely read an online article about it before I fall asleep. And so my answer is really, particularly for advanced degrees, but also for undergraduate degrees, pick the degree where you know you can do the reading, where it's going to be fun. I prefer to read trashy novels, which is why I got a rhetoric degree. And then, of course, they forced me to read poetry, and I actually found I liked poetry. It's not quite so wordy as trashy novels, and particularly Stephen King, one of the most wordy guys in the world. So if you're with me, you're not going to see a requirement for, I want a computer scientist and only a computer scientist. In fact, in my organization, I only have one computer scientist, and everybody else is self-taught and from some other discipline like myself. And the advantage of the master's degree or the doctorate degree over a simple bachelor's degree is this. At the master's level, you are expected to get some level of mastery of a particular subject matter area. And then the difference between that and a doctorate is that in the doctoral program, you're expected to figure out how to create some new knowledge. That would be the preference anyway, if you can aspire to that. So getting a master's degree at a good program will enable you to figure out how to find out as much as there is to know about a particular topic, and that's a great skill to have. You can, of course, teach yourself how to do that. I've taught myself how to do that about Harley-Davidson motorcycles, but it's not as in-depth of a area of study as sociology or counseling that I also studied. So encourage you to think about that. I've got people now who in my organization who do this, and I encourage you, if you supervise people, to help them with this. At the University of Washington, we have the capacity to offer release time so people can go to class. We will also sometimes pay for classes when they're directly related to the person's job function. And it's a good thing for everybody. For me, it's a tremendous retention strategy because people stay with me while they're getting these degrees, and sometimes because they're already working full-time, it takes them a little longer, and that means they stay a little longer. And that's a good thing for all of us. Now, there are some people for whom this is not going to be an option. I've actually had two people who continue to work for me who have bachelor's degree, and I badgered them like this in their annual performance review, and finally, at different times, both of them said to me, you know, Walt, you just need to shut up about that. I'm not going back to school. And I'll tell you why. And both of them actually told me the same story. They said, I have a learning disability, and reading is extremely challenging for me. I don't get information from the printed word. And right now, to be honest, even today in most master's and doctoral programs, you have to be able to read. And so if you have a learning disability, if you have dyslexia, if you have some issues where book learning is very challenging for you, you need to figure out a different way to do this, or be self-taught, or learn in other ways. There are other ways to learn besides reading. Unfortunately, most colleges and universities still believe in books, or some version of books that include the printed word. And so it's not for everybody. And in fact, there are people in my organization who do not have even bachelor's degrees, who are very accomplished at their jobs. And it's not a absolute requirement for me, but it is a bias of our institutions. And in fact, it's a very heavy bias, and that really means that those of us who don't have terminal degrees like doctorates and JDs and MDs are second-class citizens in our own organizations. And then within that context, even people with doctorate degrees who don't have tenure are second-class citizens to those who do have tenure. And so it goes, as Kilgore Trout says. So degrees are more important in higher education than anywhere else, and we value them, and they help validate your qualifications for that. Those are management considerations. Now, there are some other things to think about as you think about preparing yourself for a career here. One of the reasons that I call out, for example, database conversions and capital campaigns in my own autobiographical blurb that Kyle read parts of to you, is that in our business there are these cycles, and most of the cycles are annual, but a lot of them are shorter than that, and a few of them are longer than that. In the state of Washington, for example, budgeting is done on a biennial cycle, so we do a budget every 2 years instead of every 1 year. I firmly believe that a lot of these complex cycles like budgeting require at least 3 cycles to really get some level of mastery. The first time you go through it, you're a deer in the headlight. You don't know what's going on. The second time, you're beginning to get a clue, and then the third time, you can actually start working the system. Know what the rules are, know how to play it, and know how to optimize your position in these things. So as you think about your own career, you need to think about what are the cycles in your job. Some things we only do once a year. We only close out the fiscal year. We only do a year-end report once a year. You're not going to, if you're in the reporting business, you're not going to be really great at doing a year-end report until you've done 3 year-end reports, in my view. Certainly not 1. You're not going to be the best person in the world. You might be the best person in the world at your organization at doing the year-end report after 1 year, because you're the only one there who knows how to do it. But you're not going to have mastery of it the first time. So think about those cycles. If you're in annual giving and you're in direct mail, maybe you do 4 direct mails a year, or you do 8 direct mails a year. So you get 8 cycles of that particular pursuit, from data selection to production, to design, to production, to delivery, to receipt throughout the cycle. And so your cycles go a lot faster. If you're in the student calling program, your cycles go a lot faster. You do markets every week or every 2 weeks or something like that. So figure out what cycles are going on. As you advance in your career, and as you sink into the detail of your organization, you realize that some of these cycles are very long, like capital campaigns. I haven't been in a capital campaign that was less than 8 years long. That's why in almost 33 years I've only done 3 capital campaigns. I'm going to do 1 more before I quit this, at least. Same thing with database conversions, something not to be taken lightly in our business. You don't want to have to do it very often, but sometimes it becomes mandatory. So figure out what some of these cycles are. And in prospect research, for example, we just did a huge data acquisition and append in preparation for our next campaign. It's something that we haven't done for almost 10 years. That's something that you wouldn't have had the experience in if you had been there 5 years previous to last year. You wouldn't have done this full-on data append of all this demographic data, just because at our institution we haven't done it that often. So think about those cycles, and then think about how those interact with what your story is as expressed in your resume. Because if I'm looking at your resume, and if you apply for a job with me, I will look at your resume, I promise. I do not have HR screen apps for me. I look at every single resume. I want to see how long you've been at your place and what kinds of responsibilities you've had and how many cycles I can project onto you. My theory of mind about your job performance is going to include your experience of these kinds of cycles relative to the job to which you aspire in my organization. So that really means that you need to stick around a little bit most of the time. Now, I always ask the question about why people move, because sometimes there are good answers to that question. It is a bias of mine that I like people who stick around and I don't care for people who flit too often, but sometimes there are good reasons to flit. And a couple of those reasons are, of course, that your spouse or partner gets career opportunities and you move with them, and it does disrupt your career. It is something that happens, and particularly, for example, people who worked for IBM back in the 80s, and this may be true now still, used to say IBM stands for I've been moved. And that meant that at IBM, if you wanted to advance in your career, you had to move. You didn't get the next promotion by staying in the same location. You had to change locations. Well, if you're married or partnered up with a person who's in that situation, you're moving too, probably. So that's something I'll consider. Women take time off for childbirth and childcare. No harm, no foul. We're not punishing you for doing these things, but you need to be forthright and upfront about it. Another great answer that I got on this was from a marketing professional. And what she told me was that she perceived her need for career advancement in terms of a toolbox. That was her metaphor. And she said, in the marketing jobs that I've had the opportunity to do very specific kinds of campaigns, ad campaigns, marketing campaigns, and at each institution or organization that I worked, I got slotted into a role within the marketing department, and it's not easy at all in marketing in the same organization to change your role. And so I purposely moved every time I felt I had mastery of a particular set of tools in that marketing space. I would move to another organization where I could get access to the opportunity to get experience and learn how to use other tool sets that I felt would make me a comprehensive marketer. So she was moving every 18 months, but the duration of her moves was getting longer and longer as she got more responsibility and more tools in her toolkit. So I think about that. Now you notice I'm moving more from management considerations into the considerations of how I might look at an application. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because the advancing your career is of course depending on the hiring official, and I'm only a sample of one on being a hiring official. I can't tell you how other hiring officials are working, but I've worked as a staff or chair of many, many dozens of search committees, including many executive level positions, and I know what I look for and what the hiring officials to whom I'm directing the candidates look for. So I'll talk a little bit about that. The first one being, don't move too much unless you're prepared to tell me why you did it and why that doesn't hurt you and in fact may make you better. Actually, that was the second one. The first one was the advanced degree part of things. The other thing that you need to think about is that we as hiring officials want you to really want the job you're applying for. Now that may seem kind of obvious, but when you ask people, and it's a stock interview question, what interests you about this job? I've had the answer, the University of Washington has wonderful benefits, and I'd like to take advantage of that. Does that sound like a good answer to you? I've had the response, well, my spouse just moved into the area and I need to find a job somewhere in Seattle. I've had the response, the University of Washington is a great employer and has a wonderful cause, and I would love to work for the university. I've had the response, I've heard that university advancement at the University of Washington is a fabulous place to work and I really want to get a job in advancement. I've had the answer, I've heard your advancement services operation is a terrific opportunity and I'd love to work in advancement services. So I'm going from the general to the specific here, you might notice. So far, none of those answers float my boat. The answer that floats my boat is, I want this job. It looks like a job that was made for me. I have the perfect skill set to bring to this job, and I really aspire to having this particular job, and here's why. That is the right answer. That's my bias, I'm just telling you. You want to be in the position of wanting the job that you're applying for. Now I know, particularly in the economy we've been in, that's not a luxury that everybody has all the time. Sometimes you have to pay the bills and you have to get the job that you can get. But nonetheless, that's the answer that you need to give to help you get that job, okay? It may not be your dream job. It may not even be the stepping stone to your dream job, but you need to at least pretend to me that it's the job that you really want for the time being anyway. So think about that. The next consideration as I think about these things is that I want to see some aspiration in your approach to the job. When faced with a person who does not have all of the experience I want and someone who does have all the experience that I want, I actually have a bias toward the person who's aspiring to the next level as opposed to the person who wants to transfer from the same job at someplace else to the other job here. Now again, I'll lift up that bias if you give me the good answer about why that would be the case. Well, my spouse or partner took a great opportunity here and I'd love to continue to do what I'm doing over there. Here, again, can be a great answer. Or I took a couple years off to have my child and to get him or her started in this world, and now I'm ready to come back to work and I want to pick up where I left off. These are totally satisfactory answers. You can overcome my bias, in other words. I'm not saying that I'm totally rigid on this, but I like to see some aspiration. I like strivers in my organization. I find that strivers help me with the whole headroom issue more than people who aren't striving. So biases, again, but you need to kind of suss out the biases of the people for whom you aspire to work. Those are some considerations, and you'll notice that I've been talking for 35 minutes and I haven't even mentioned the specific skill sets I'm looking for. Quite frankly, as Connie said in the keynote yesterday, we believe we can probably train you in a lot of the skill sets you're going to need to do the job here. You're going to need to enculturate anyway. You don't know the culture of the UW, you don't know how we do the business. You'll have a lot to learn no matter what skills you bring in. Of course, I want people who know how to write code if I'm hiring a developer, for example. I want people who have some skills in the area. But I'm actually less concerned about that typically than I'm concerned about making sure I get what Connie said, which is smart, hardworking, and caring, and what I said, which is aspiring, upwardly mobile, on an upward trajectory, motivated, really wants this job, and so forth. So those are the kinds of things that I think about. Now I'm going to ask you, what do you guys think about? Some of you are already managers. Tell us what I've left out. What else is important to you? What do you want me to be thinking about that I'm obviously too dense to think about in this context? I know it's nap time, you guys.
What are your thoughts on the consulting field and our relationship with consultants and both hiring consultants for personal purposes or people moving out into the consulting field?
Consulting looks to me like an extremely challenging job. And I had dinner with one of the consultants who's here. Her name is Charlotte McGee from Grenzebach Glare, a 32-year career in an insider role, and now an 18 to 19-year career as a consultant afterwards. And I asked her about it because the challenge with being a consultant for me, from my perspective, and I've done a little consulting, but I don't do it for money. I do it for love. And is that you bring a bunch of great ideas, but you don't actually get to implement. So I think that we use consultants quite regularly, and we hire people to advise us on things, either from an internal or from external. So for example, Kirk Bailey this morning was talking about how he interacts with me in particular relative to data security and our advancement data. I'm using Kirk as a consultant. I actually love consultants with expertise. I don't have enough data security work to hire my own data security person. So there are a lot of those kind of niches where I think you have to use consultants, and that consultants are very important. I also think that the opportunity to go out and do consulting and help some of these one-person shops or these small organizations is wonderful. I have a colleague who works out of Wilmington, North Carolina, and he consults with very, very small organizations like regional Boy Scouts councils and the Pig Farmers Association. They apparently have a big some marketing issues having to do with aromas or something like that they need consultants with. Pig farmers don't know exactly how to manage their reaction to people's complaints about how their farms smell because they can't smell them anymore. So lots of good roles for consultants out there. I think it's very challenging, and particularly if you're on a billable hours kind of a deal. It's a tough gig, but is that something you want to do?
I mean, I don't know, if you've been at an institution for a while, what are your, moving from one institution to another, or moving into consulting, or, or staying at an institution for the length of time? It's kind of like, how do you move to the next step in your career?
Yeah. Well, there's lots of consulting firms out there, and they're always recruiting. It's interesting to me to think about it because there could be opportunities for me as well, but I don't know. I've always been an insider, and I value my insider role because I actually I get to see things through, which I don't think consultants do very often.
So a year or two ago, I let myself be kind of drug kicking and screaming to LinkedIn. And ever since then, I've been getting endorsed for things that I don't particularly know much about. So the quality of information you might get from, at least from my LinkedIn profile, is dubious at best, and certainly incomplete. And I haven't heard you mention any kind of like online social networking or even in-person networking and elbow rubbing. And what kind of networking plays into your perception of a person besides just what they say in person and what their letter and resume say?
Well, as I said in my somewhat tongue-in-cheek intro of my boss, I'm always open to doing informational interviews, and I think that's important. And I really mean it as an informational interview, not as a pre-job application. To come and find out whatever it is you might want to know and whatever it is I might want to tell you about my organization and how we do and think about things. I think that's important, and I think that's valuable, and most places will do it. There's at least 3 of us at the executive level in my organization that do these things every couple of weeks. We do them all the time, and we love to do them because it's how we spot, one of the ways that we spot talent. The second thing is meetings like this, when you can find one that you actually get to rub elbows, as you say, with people who have similar interests and similar responsibilities professionally. It's great. It's great for them, and it's great for you. Beyond that, the usual caveats about your visible public presence on the web all apply here. I want to see professionalism in those places as well. And yes, there are actually some ethical considerations relative to doing searches and so forth on people. We have to avoid bias in terms of race or ethnicity or age or something like that. Back in the old days, back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, job applications often required a headshot, a photograph. And those photographs were used to weed out people of races who the hiring official didn't want to have. Be blunt about it. We can't use those media to do that sort of thing here, and we're not going to. But we perhaps will go out to see what your level of professionalism is in your web presence, such as it is or isn't. Very hard not to have one these days if you at all are in the public space. So those are a few things. The educational part is also good. You meet a lot of people, particularly at the graduate level, who have similar interests, and you can follow that as well.
When you talk about the higher education and hiring people who have self-taught skills, what are you looking for in a description for those kind of self-taught skills? I mean, I come from a liberal arts background, but I use those skills all the time, but they don't apply directly to what I do.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's lots of skills that that I've learned myself or that I've picked up over the years. But how do you want to? What's important to you in describing those skills when you're either talking to somebody or looking at their resume?
Well, the hard skills like access to particular tools, hardware and software, you can list, and I particularly want you to match up what I've put in the job description to what you list, so that you don't leave it to me to connect the dots. Connect the dots for me, either in your resume or your cover letter. Just as an aside, the University of Washington uses this tool called UW Hires. It's an online tool. You put your resume in there, and then you can apply for multiple jobs. And the challenge with that is that you can't craft your resume for every single job, especially if you're applying for 2 jobs at the same time. So you have to do it in your cover letter, for example. The usual advice is craft your resume every time, but when you're using these online forms, sometimes you can't. So connect the dots for me. With the softer skills like personnel management, strategic planning, and budgeting, tell me what you can about what you've done. Give the example. Volunteer gigs are also fine for this. Many people get budget experience or direct fundraising experience by doing volunteer gigs because their job doesn't allow them to get that. So there's various ways you can describe that. And then finally, when you come in and you're telling me why this is the job for you, that's your very specific opportunity to tell me that you know how to do what I want you to do. And tell me what you don't know how to do, what I will have to train you in. Because as I said, I'm more likely to hire a person who aspires to something higher than what they've already done. And so let's be upfront about what you're going to have to learn in order to be a well-rounded individual in that position, and don't try to hide that. So do both things, in other words.
I noticed that none of us are actually answering your question, so I'm going to ask you another one. How do you can you give us some guidance on compensation and how do you have that conversation about compensation when you're hiring someone new to your team, especially because we work at public institutions and pretty much everyone knows what we make, and so how do you have that first conversation when you're hiring someone new, and how do you keep having that ongoing conversation as you do annual reviews?
Yeah. This is a huge pain point for me now, because we're now in about 4.5 years of salary freezes in my institution. And the place where you need to have that conversation is on entry, because we've been frozen for so long. So I always tell folks, get it going in. You know, you need to push me on that. You can actually go online. The state of Washington publishes all of our compensation. It's often a couple years out of date. If you go to the library at the University of Washington, they have a printout that will show the compensation. So you can find people in the unit using the directory and then find out what they're paid. It's all public information. So you can see that and get kind of an idea of the range. I also think it's totally appropriate to ask at the outset what the range of compensation is. I actually want to know your qualifications. It's going to be a dance, because I'm going to pay you more for certain qualifications depending on what the market is here for those qualifications. And that's particularly true in the technical and developer skill sets, because I can't compete. I'm in a marketplace that has a significant footprint by Microsoft, Google, Adobe, Amazon, and they are snatching up and overcompensating the people that I want with the same skill sets. And so I have to compete on more ephemeral things like working for a great cause and having a real dedication to work-life balance. You can go to work for Microsoft and make more money, but you can also work 80 hours a week there and then end up putting out a nice piece of software that people take pot shots at for the rest of its term of existence. So, but that's a problem for me. Compensation is a problem for all of us, I think. But right now at the University of Washington, it's a big problem for me. And if I hire you and I compensate you too generously, then all the people who've been loyally working for me for those 4.5 years are going to come and whine at me significantly during that annual review period. So I always have to be mindful of that stuff too. But bottom line, get it going in. Yes?
Do you have some clues or tricks through getting through the, I don't know how to say this kindly, nepotism, cronyism that happens, I think in all large institutions, but certainly the University of Washington Children's Hospital. I mean, it's very difficult to land jobs or interviews, to talk to people within a lot of these organizations if you don't know somebody who's going to push your resume forward.
That's right. My first clue is to do the informational interview. Come and see me, even before a job is listed. If you want to work at my organization, you want to work at my institution, and if you want to work in advancement, you can come and see me. I'm not just saying advancement services. I'll talk to anybody about advancement at the University of Washington. I'm one of 7 members of the executive leadership of that team, and I can talk about the whole scope. So that's a good place to start. And my colleague Greg Sheridan does this a lot. We're always looking for talent. We also have a recruiter who's here yesterday and today. Her name's Amy Manio, and she stockpiles lists of people who look really promising, and then thinks about them when particular jobs become available. So you can do that. That's another clue. But you're absolutely right. And sometimes we are required to have open and competitive searches, even though we know that we want to hire somebody who's internal, and that's a brutal fact. That is unfortunate, but sometimes true. But that's about the best I can do. Have a reputation, a positive reputation preferably, because it really is a small world. We don't know what the real degrees of separation are, but particularly in advancement IT, there aren't very many degrees of separation, and somebody I know knows you. I can promise you that. So I will pull those strings. When I do reference checks, I always say, I ask if you're a finalist and I'm doing reference checks, I'll say to you, is it okay if I talk to people you didn't list as a reference? And then I will say to your references, is there someone else who can speak specifically to this or that point about this individual? So be aware of that as well. Your references can help you on this.
I think one of the things, an attribute too, that I would submit to your question would be a person that would be humble. And the way that I define that is when you go into that interview process, so you're looking for someone who's passionate, you want to know someone who's smart, but also you want them, specifically on smaller teams, you want them to be, willing to take the time to train someone or teach someone or, listen to the situation. So that would be, to answer your question earlier, maybe one of the attributes would be, is this person humble in that sense? So they're really smart, but they can't teach anybody anything, or they're really difficult to work with, and it just creates other problems for you that you may have not had before. So.
Absolutely, and that's a specific within the more general topic of fit. How do you fit? And I want to hire people who aren't like me because I'm sick of me and I need other people who are more interesting. So, but you got to be, you need to do that. You need to be mindful of having people with genuine diversity, not just ethnic, racial, but age, skill set, outlook, point of view, etc. So I've burned all the time. I'm happy to continue to talk, however. So, but you're all excused if you wish to leave.
You touched on managing down. You haven't touched on managing up.
Oh yeah.
He stayed where he is by managing up.
Yeah, the thing about managing up is, again, part of it's get it going in. One of the things, as I said, I was talking to Charlotte McGee, and she's been in consulting for more than 15 years, and I was talking to her about the relative positioning of advancement services leadership in our kinds of organizations. And she told me that my position is really unusual in that I report directly to the vice president for university advancement. A friend of mine just went from here over to Michigan, and he said that the director of advancement services reports to the campaign director, who reports to him, who reports to the VP of development. And Charlotte said to me, most VPs of development or CEOs of these organizations, they don't want to do the data. They just want to know that it's getting done and keep me out of it. But in 1990, when I went to Washington State, I said I will. One of the ways, reasons I will come is because I will have the opportunity to report to the VP. So, and that was in the interview process. You need to do the same thing. You need to ask for some of the things that I have said, like release time to go get that degree, ways to get headroom. All of those sorts of things. You can tell me how you're going to add value by having more time, and we'll see what we can do to get it. Managing up and managing sideways too. It's not just about managing down, but absolutely, it's mandatory. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that, I'm sorry I'm going over, but one of the things that one of our values at the University of Washington is a concept we call institutionalizing advancement. And that's because we don't believe that the development professionals can really raise all the money we need to raise. We need the subject matter experts on students, on faculty, on research, on medical issues to be there in the room with us. We need to institutionalize advancement. But at our level, if we're IT people or fundraising scientists or annual giving people or whatever we may be, we need to get involved in the larger life of the campus. So from my point of view, what that means is that I sit on the data management committee for the whole university. I sit on the privacy assurance and system security council for the whole university. I'm on 5 different university-wide committees about data. It is the absolute dullest work in the world. It is committee work. It's outside of my area of expertise or my comfort zone. I've been in development for more than 30 years and I don't know anything about HR payroll systems. But I volunteer for these things because it's part of the way that we institutionalize advancement. I take my knowledge to these things, and actually over 11 years I've been able to develop something of a reputation for actually knowing what I'm talking about and positioning particularly our advancement database as one of the core administrative databases at the institution. How many of you actually have that? But before 10 years ago, they thought, here are the big administrative databases: HR, payroll, student, and finance. Those are the big three. Then you got all those trivial ones like advancement and transportation services and housing and dining services and the facility services that manages all the rooms and available teaching spaces and so forth. And those are all kind of second-class citizens. Well, I want alumni donor to be recognized as one of the big four.
To add to that, it took quite a while for us to be recognized as an institutional function and entitled to see FERPA-protected student records. We are an institutional function. We're a critical one, but people thought, no, fundraising, you can't trust those people. And that took years of building bridges.
That's right. And you can't build that bridge in the advancement shop. You have to get out.
That's what you're doing, you're networking.
That's right.
You're networking within your.
That's right. And
So they trust you and they'll come to your table because you went to theirs.
because I helped them out.
Right.
And I sat through their interminable committee meetings talking about data values that I don't really care about very much.
Locked into a coma.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your kind attention and for participating.